Well, basically, the session is on social protection and human rights, and it's done in the context of the social protection human rights web platform, which is a joint UN web platform, which you see here. And so it is a particular pleasure to be here and to chair this session with the very eminent speakers. And I'm sorry, I'm not really contributing to the gender balance of this panel. Initially, it was Paul Ladd, the director of UNRISD, who was meant to chair this panel. Unfortunately, he had to pull out at the very last minute. So we have now an all-female panel, which is not very gender balanced, but I think it makes up for centuries of male dominance.
And we don't want them to take that money.
So that's it. So let me just a couple of words on the social protection human rights platform, which actually grew out of an initiative by Magdalena Sepúlveda, as a former UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, who already during her mandate has worked a lot on social protection and human rights and has done enormous work to bring these sometimes unfortunately quite unrelated subjects together. And Magdalena has started this web platform after her mandate, especially when she was with UNRISD. And at some point the ILO actually joined, and together we built a web platform which is a kind of a standalone web platform as a joint UN web platform. And in the meantime, we're very happy that it's now actually 11 different UN units and agencies having joined that platform. So it's really a joint one UN work with 11 partners, which are FAO, ILO, the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights, UNAIDS, UNICEF, UNRISD, UN Women, plus four of the 5 regional commissions. So the Economic Commission for Africa, ECLAC, ESCAP, and ESPA. So it is a nice group of agencies and UN units. And the basic idea and the purpose of it is really kind of to bring together the topics of human rights and social protection, emphasize the work, and also translate it into very much from a subject which is very complex and being dealt with by human rights lawyers to a very practical application. So to really see what does it mean for the financing of social protection? What does it mean for the administration? What does it mean for having the social protection benefits and services inclusive for vulnerable groups, etc. So it's really about translating it into very practical matters, and this is actually the purpose of that platform. So I would like first, before introducing the speakers, I would first like to give the word to Katja from UNRISD, who has actually been organizing this panel for us.
Yeah, thank you very much, Christina, and also a warm welcome on behalf of UNRISD, the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development. I think one of the strengths of UNRISD is actually to bridge different communities and to join debates that are often fragmented and disconnected. And as Christina said, the debate about social protection and human rights has been one that was led and developed in different communities. Although, as we will see from the different presentations today, there are many synergies and it's actually crucial to use a human rights-based approach for designing, implementing, and also reviewing and monitoring social protection policies. This is why, with the help of Magdalena, we initiated and created this platform a couple of years ago, and we are very lucky that we could join forces with the ILO, and since then have really developed this platform further and organized a lot of interesting events actually to provide a space and a platform of debate and of resources that the different communities can use to improve their work. We are also therefore very grateful that the organizers of the Regulating Decent Work Conference have given us this space to organize this special session today. So I give back the word to Christina and look forward to the presentations and discussions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Katja, and thank you for the enormous work in organizing this panel. So let's turn to our speakers. And just as a word of introduction, I think, I mean, they all don't really need an introduction, I think, in this audience. But let's start with Magdalena Sepúlveda. Magdalena is a senior research associate with UNRISD, but she has also a lot of other heads. And she used to be the UN Special Rapporteur for Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, but she's also a member of the steering committee of the high-level panel of experts of food security and nutrition of the United Nations Committee of World Food Security, and a member of the Independent Commission for the Reform of International Corporate Taxation. And I think that with that she brings in a very rich perspective to the topic, and again really translating the human rights approach into very practical matters, especially when it comes to food security and taxation, but also many others. And Magdalena is going to talk about the human rights-based approach to social protection implications for the future of work. And I think I'll do a first round of introduction for everyone, and then
I was ready to talk.
Yeah, I saw. So the second speaker will be Valeria Esquivel, who also has a long history with UNRISD, but we're lucky to have her in the IO now. And Valeria is an economist and gender specialist, and she will be speaking about care policies as part of social protection lessons from Uruguay and Costa Rica. And I should also say that prior to joining UNRISD, she was Associate Professor of Economics at the Universidad Nacional de Sarmiento in Argentina, and a researcher for the Argentine National Research Council. So very happy to have you here as well. Gabriele has a very rich history in different UN organizations. She was with ESCAP, she was with UNCTAD, she was with UNDP and with UNICEF, and is now also associated with UNRISD. And she comes with this very rich experience, and she's going to talk about the rights-based approach to social policy in South Asia, where you have and Southeast Asia, where you have spent much of your professional life. And last but not least, you're very far away, Catalina.
And I'm
Yeah. Catalina is the UN Special Rapporteur on the rights of persons with disabilities. And we're very happy to have you here in our panel. And Catalina has been, her first report actually under her mandate was on social protection and inclusion for persons with disabilities. And she is a lawyer by training, and she comes here also with a very rich perspective in these matters. And she's going to talk about leaving no one behind, disability inclusive social protection. So this just for setting the scene. So I would now like to ask Magdalena to start us off, and I hope that we can all stick to the time, so that we can leave a bit of space for discussion at the end. And I should also say that Katja will be commenting on the papers after we've heard all the full papers. So up to you, Magdalena.
Thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be here with you today, and in this presentation, I'm really going to try to very loyal to the rights-based approach. So I'm going to start with a legal approach, and then I'm going to move this legal approach to specific programs. The idea is to really show why it is important to have a human rights approach and how a rights-based approach can assist in improving social protection systems in general. But what I'm going to discuss today is how, in particular, it can assist social assistance programs. One of the main challenges today for social assistance programs is to increase inclusion. They have done a great job in coverage, but still those groups that are most excluded, including children, women, ethnic minorities, persons with disabilities, in particular in low-income countries, have not been reached in the way they should. And the proposal is that a rights-based approach could help. It's not the only mechanism, but it is a tool that helps to improve inclusion. And I'm going to try to do this with the principles. Then what is important to note is that legal principles are, and norms and the standards are compulsory for policymakers. And oftentimes, some policymakers try to forget that when they're dealing, for example, with operational manuals or bylaws of a specific social assistance programs, they cannot forget that they do have a lot of laws and regulations or norms that they should comply with. And the principles of equality and non-discrimination is a critical one. In most countries of the world, this principle is established in the constitutions or Bill of Rights. And it is a principle that has to be respected in all the state norms or regulations and practices. And I'm going to discuss today what is the implication for social assistance programs. I have to start briefly with what it is, this principle of non-discrimination. The principle of equality does not mean that everyone needs to be treated equally. On the contrary, everyone needs to be treated according to their own differences. It requires to analyze each situation. In international law and domestic law, there is a very well-developed criteria to assess when a distinction, exclusion, restriction, or preference has been discriminatory or not. And it is a very simple set of criteria. First, it has to be objective, and the differentiation has to be objective and reasonable. So it's not objective and reasonable to treat a yellow person and a red person, but it might be objective and reasonable to treat a woman and a man differently, or to treat everyone that have suffered from historical and structural discrimination differently. Because this principle also requires to take affirmative action in order to support those who have suffered from structural inequalities. There are several prohibited grounds for discrimination, and the principle of non-discrimination also required impose the prohibition of direct discrimination and indirect. That means even if you don't have the intention to discriminate, if the final impact is discriminatory, that is forbidden. That means if you have a neutral law that applies to men and women equally, but the impact is differently, that is also forbidden. And that's it. I'm not going to go more for the principle of equality and non-discrimination. I'm going to move. Another important component of this principle is that, so you have to avoid any distinction or differentiation or preferential treatment on the ground prohibited: race, nationality, gender, ethnic origin, disabilities, etc. You have to take affirmative action in order to leveling the playing field for those who have suffered from structural discrimination. And yet, international law has developed a very useful standard to assess discrimination, and these are the standards of accessibility, affordability, adaptability, and gender sensitivity. And these are the standards that I'm going to propose today, that when you apply them to social protection systems, you can assess whether or not they're being discriminatory. So the idea is that you apply these standards all through the different stages of the delivery change of social protection system, but I'm going to talk, as said today, on social assistance program mainly. So you have to assess in each of these stages where you are complying with these principles. And now we go to the more practical way. So accessibility. Accessibility implies that you have to remove all obstacles, information, administrative and physical barriers that prevent the most excluded or disadvantaged to benefit from a social protection program on an equal basis. While this sounds very logic, in reality, many programs, many social assistance programs do not comply with this principle. For example, lack of information. When the Colombia Familias en Acción programs, a conditional cash transfer, was first launched, 2/3 of the potential beneficiaries did not register because they did not have sufficient information about the program, or they did not know how to register the program. In the South Africa Child Support Grant, for example, a study has showed that 1/4 of the eligible children were not registered because of the incorrect belief that the caregiver did not qualify, because in these programs the threshold to apply has moved, and evaluation have shown that the lack of information is one of the main reasons why several of the eligible children were not part. So here, and while I'm speaking, I'm not going to go through the slides, but you can see what can be done to improve the barriers that I'm talking about. I have very little time, so that's why I'm just trying to choose. The other is the affordability, and this is also critical. Economic accessibility to all is not an issue that has been respected in many countries, and it is a major obstacle. In several countries, like in Chile, in Peru, and Pakistan, for example, in order to register to a social assistance program, a cash transfer, you're required to have a national ID. And this administrative requirement exclude most of the poor, who are the ones who do not have access to identity card, mainly women, who are sometimes not registered at birth and do not have ID. In the countries that I mentioned, for example, people are registered. There is high level of registration in Peru and in Chile. But the problem here is affordability. Why? Just to give you an example, to get the ID in Peru, it costs $14, the equivalent. In Chile, $6, and in Pakistan, the equivalent of $2. So as you can imagine, for many, the fact that you require this ID, it makes the whole program unaffordable. And this is not the only program. Many times what you have to do is to collect several documents from different offices, and that of course has a direct and indirect cost. The same happens when you have to go to different places. Those who live in isolated places actually do not have the money to go. In the cash transfer program of Orphan and Vulnerable Child in Kenya, another important cash transfer program, an evaluation showed that there was this one region, one district, that it was Garissa, in which the great majority of those who lived there needed to pay a motorized transportation and spend one night out of their home in order to register. In this case, for example, the program, after doing this evaluation, compensated for the cost. I should say the cost of doing this, of course, was higher than the cost of the benefit. So that was a major factor of exclusion, that at the end the program compensated for that money. Then we have adaptability. Adaptability implies to ensure that the program takes into account the values and the obstacles that people face. These obstacles can also be technological challenges, in particular that the most excluded will face. Just to give you examples, in the child support grant in South Africa, a study shown, an evaluation shown, that in the northwest of South Africa, the very entrenched tradition and cultural beliefs that new mothers could not go out with the baby in the first 3 months of the baby was born was the major cause of exclusion from the child support grant for an important amount of people living in all this region. So how to ensure that this does not happen, and as I said here and in the slides you can see what are the measures that need to be taken, it's a very simple one: ask people. I mean, you cannot implement these programs if you actually do not know what are these cultural beliefs. In Ecuador, for example, in the Bono de Desarrollo Humano, another cash transfer program, many indigenous women were not collecting the money that they received from the cash transfer program because they were mistreated by the security guards in the banks where they needed to collect the money. And again, this factor was an important exclusion for them. And I need to hurry up. Then this can also happen with technological barriers. And this is, for example, in many countries around the world, there are important initiatives of implementing a biometric system for social assistance programs. And again, there is evidence, for example, that fingerprint scanners fail to collect the data of children and older persons who, for example, in the Andahar program in India, have been excluded because of this. People, manual workers who work with their hands, also tend not to have fingerprints that are readable. So again, this is something that needs to be taken into account. In the Benazir Bhutto Income Support Program in Pakistan, for example, the program's designers realized that they needed to take into account the restriction in mobility of women beneficiaries of the program. So they made some arrangements to the design, so women are not required to go to collect the money, but the money is received by the post office. And finally, of course, it has to be gender sensitive. And this is very important, and the challenges goes as in terms of restriction in mobility that I mentioned, to issues such as in the South Africa case, the study have also shown that for many women, for example, they were not accessing the office for recruitment just because they were not toilet or breastfeeding facilities. And you have to understand this with the fact that in average, it has been estimated that in order to register to this program, it takes a queue of 20 hours. So that is the fact. Then it's not easy to apply the principle of equality and non-discrimination. I still have 2 minutes, I'm here. But then what are the problems? Very, very fast. Of course, lack of disaggregated data. You need to know the specific needs of the vulnerable groups, and you need disaggregated data. There are unintended discriminatory impact that you have to evaluate in the design. If you put a public work program that takes women, mothers, for example, to work, it might have an unintended discriminatory impact with the girls of the household that benefit, who might ended up, and this has been evidence as well, ended up assuming a lot of unpaid care work. There is, in many countries, limited administrative and managerial capacity of the social assistant administration. There is a problem with the unwilling to zoom in. So many programs look at the family as the household in general. For example, eligibility criteria that look at the income of the household without looking how that income is distributed within the household, having probably a negative impact on older women and girls that do not receive equal distribution within the household. There are some entrenched discriminatory practice and prejudice, so it's very hard to fight with this in the society, and there is a lack of meaningful and effective participation. In 1 minute, this, of course, everything that I have said, it has been challenged in the court, so it has a practical implication. I'm going to give just one example. I told you at the beginning that the principle of equality and non-discrimination required to assess whether or not the different treatment has been objective and reasonable, and if it's proportional to the means that you're trying to achieve. So, for example, in several countries, like in South Africa, at the beginning, there was a different age for men and women receiving in the case of South Africa, the social pension. So it was 60 for men, 60 for women and 65 for men. So is this a reasonable and objective differentiation? Well, this was decided by the court. So the government in that case of South Africa, they explained that due to the apartheid history and the history of women in Africa, there was a reason why to discriminate. There was a reason why to treat differently men and women in accessing the social pension. So the court there decided in the favor of the government, but immediately after, the government changed the law and progressively include in 3 years the same age for men and women to receive a social pension. This is contextually specific. The same case in the UK, for example, in which the winter allowance for older people had also a difference in 60 and 65. And then the European Court of Justice decided that was discriminatory. The same happened there. I have 1 minute, I cannot go in detail. In the Costa case, for example, in South Africa, it was a case brought by some Mozambican permanent residents in South Africa that considered that it was discriminatory, that they were not able to receive the social assistance in the same level that South African and in that other national South African, and the court in that case decided that they were right, and now in South Africa permanent residents receive the same benefit, and not only that, in South Africa, for example, refugees receive the same benefits as national. I'm going to leave it there, but what I wanted to show with the presentation was simply this is not a theoretical approach. So these legal norms and principles that can be arid for non-lawyer has a very practical implication in the way in which you implement social protection system, and social protection policymakers need to take this principle into account. And as I said, in the cases that I mentioned, this can be a very good tool to improve inclusion in the program from the most vulnerable and disadvantaged. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Of course, it's an honor to be now at home at the ILO presenting this work, which comes from background work for UNRISD flagship report on the chapter 3 of that flagship report published last year was about care policies. So, of course, the flagship report has many other dimensions, but for this panel, what I wanted to emphasize is the way in which care policies as part, I think I should have said as a pillar of social protection, has progressed in Latin America, and why is that, or what is the relationship between that and a social protection, a human rights approach to social protection that has progressed in Latin America, and the advantages and the lessons learned from Uruguay and Costa Rica. So it's a restricted focus vis-a-vis all the other dimensions that the flagship chapter has, but emphasizing these two lessons because I think have all the condiments of what a transformative care policies are or could look like. So first of all, a definition of care policies, which might be contested even. So care policies are public policies that assign resources to care in the form of money, services, or time. So they range from payments and subsidies to caregivers or to persons who need care, to the direct provision of care services, or even complementary services provision such as water and sanitation. So, and they include also labor regulations such as maternity protection and paternity leave, and the regulation of paid working time that assign time to care. So therefore, the care policies are really a panoply, I learned that word today, so of care initiatives developed by various sectors, including health and education, labor and social policies, and they serve very different purposes. But what we said in the flagship report is that framing these policies, which are social policies and labor policy, in the umbrella or under the umbrella of care can be a game changer. And this is not something that comes out of the blue, it comes out of the Sustainable Development Goal 5, the gender goal, which says that we should recognize in Target 5.4, recognize and value unpaid care and domestic work through care policies. And it's very explicit which these policies are. It is public, it says public care service provision, infrastructure, and social protection. And this is one of the 3 times social protection is explicitly mentioned in a target. So the entry point of social protection is something we should pay a lot of attention to. The definition of transformative care policies is one that we've struggled with, but I think it is a rights-based one we propose, and these are policies that are able to guarantee the rights, agency, autonomy, and well-being of caregivers and care receivers. And we know this has a strong gender dimension, but not only. And frequently the framework is putting these caregivers and care receivers in tension. Typically, in terms of care workers, paid care workers, the idea is that if they improve their working situation, they might increase costs and fees, for example. So, in a way, it's typical to when we go from the ideal to the nitty-gritty details, that these two groups are put in tension. And we want to claim very strongly that good quality care is good quality work for in the care sector, the very same way Sue Himmelwaite argued. But it's also beyond that, is kind of coming together of caregivers and care receivers in progressive ways. So why is it that this umbrella has worked so well, and in particular in the cases of Latin America? Because it has allowed a conversation across sectors. And in a way, what we have seen in Latin America in general is that conversation across sectors, across health, education, and social policy people, or anti-poverty policies, for lack of a better way of calling them, can actually talk to each other and come together in institutionalized ways. So, for example, many countries, Chile, Ecuador, El Salvador, and Mexico, have implemented care policy coordination mechanisms within the government, including officials from social development ministries, people who are specializing in children, people who specialize on women and persons with disabilities, and representatives of education, health, and social security sector. The need for coordination has been allowed using the care as an entry point. In all cases, care is an entry point, and the fertile soil is the human rights approach to social protection. You need the two. But also, again, it's in general, it's coordination mechanism within some ministries. There are issues about budget. There are tensions. This is not, how can I say? This is not smoothly run, especially for budgetary reasons. But these coordination mechanisms have also allowed women's machineries to be sitting there who are not normally there. But in particular, I would like to single out the two cases that have really more progress, although there is lots of talk in the region about this idea of a care system. The Uruguayan one is very interesting. We know Uruguay is a small country, and in fact, I will present Uruguay and Costa Rica, both small countries, and we can certainly say that in bigger countries in the region, like Mexico or Brazil or Argentina, even these coordination mechanisms could be harder to implement. But I think the move is to start talking about this national care systems everywhere in the region. SNIC stands for Sistema Nacional Integrado de Cuidados, a national Uruguayan care system, which was established by law at the end of 2015, but it was over 7 years in the making. 7 years and 3 progressive presidencies, which I will come back to in a moment. The idea of the SNIC was including existing and new social policies, for example, for persons with disabilities and persons with special care needs. I omitted there, but it's also the objective of universalizing coverage for 3 years old and progressively going to or increasing the coverage of 0 to 2 year olds. And in that coverage, not only via services, but also via parental leaves. One important aspect, and then I will tell you why that aspect is there, is that both care workers and care providers in general, and this means women in the unpaid economy or unpaid care work, are also a target population. And even it is stated that one of the objectives is to change the sexual division of labor. So that's stated as an objective. And that is very interesting, and it's certainly the result of feminist and women's movements' engagement with this process. The framework is a framework of co-responsibility of the state, the community, the market, and the families, and both men and women within it. The co-responsibility framework has a long history in Latin America, and it's to me it's another way of talking about the triple R in the region, but it has more emphasis, I should say, on the labor market side of care provision. It's of course a rights-based approach. It is solidarian in the financing and has the universality in coverage as an aim. Of course, like any process, it is achieved by phases and not immediately at once. But the universality vision is driving progress, and that is particularly important. In practical terms, the SNIC implies an intersectoral coordination mechanism which has a dedicated secretariat well, I have 2 cases, half of it, a dedicated secretariat and an advisory board where the women's machinery are, but also the civil society are there. And of course, all these other policy makers of different ministries. One interesting thing is when the talk and the start of this sneak started, it was going to be only a coordination mechanism. But in Latin America, if you don't have the money, you cannot implement policy. So if you have a coordination mechanism without really allocating budget to it, it was going to be a figurehead, you say, or something that is really not effective. So by the time all this process progressed, it was allocated clearly to not only to coordinate, but actually to put in place childcare and persons with disabilities special policies. So in that way, this gave it traction. The Red Nacional, Red de Cuido in Costa Rica is narrower in the sense that it's only a childhood care policy for children under 7. It states again that it wants to allow women's labor force participation. Again, there is a strong gender component. The co-responsibility of care as a framework and the rights-based approach to care are in the law and are in an integral part of it. And there is this commonality of the intersectoral coordination mechanism, along with all the challenges of trying to universalize a policy and how that progresses. But let me go to the lessons, which I would like to focus on before ending. These policies don't come out of the blue and are the result of political fights. So they are not technocratic only issues. And in fact, the Uruguay, and I have been in contact with the people actually enacting the policies, and it's very interesting how the vision guides the everyday decisions that are so tough. For example, that they both include the regulation of private providers and how that actually takes place when they say that they covered X number of children, but when they visit the place, that X number of children are not there, for example. So it's a hard work at every day. But why do we have the rights-based approach and the strong feminist perspective? Because of the strong and sustained mobilization and alliances between women's care recipients and social movements, which at different points had different agendas, and they had to come together. The expert involvement by academics in both cases has been important because it gave the stamp of approval from the university, from even from data. In the case of Uruguay, the time use data was used to make the case. But also the ability of these movements to make the care agenda part of the political platforms before the elections. In both cases, in these two countries, when you get actually into government, you respect those political platforms, which might not be the case everywhere, but in particular in Costa Rica, the platform becomes a legal instrument, so you really have to respect that. But so the fact that it was a part of an electoral platform really made the room for these policies be part of actually the governing parties or the governments. There was time to develop state ownership. Particularly in the case of Uruguay, the idea was in the making for some time, and was the civil society was progressing in getting consensus inside the government. Different parties were called upon to provide the views and to develop ownership for this thing that was going to happen. Again, the rights-based approach to care is part of a rights-based approach to social protection policies and couldn't have happened without it. And last but not least, the Uruguayan SNCC defines itself as the fourth pillar of social protection, meaning that these care policies have to be part of social protection. And I think integrating that vision in Uruguay makes for a strong debate about how we integrate care in social protection systems, but also what the content of the SDG mandate, Target 5.4, on care policies through social protection system is going to actually mean, the content of that mandate. And I think Uruguay and Costa Rica show that. And finally, an invitation to read the bigger thing, which is the flagship report, UNRISD flagship report, and in particular Chapter 3. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Christine and Katja, for organizing this very important discussion. What I'd like to contribute is another regional example from Asia, from South and Southeast Asia, looking at what might be there in terms of transformative potential, human rights-based potential, and in terms of how this is a very political process. Starting from norms, what we've been hearing and what we know and what I hope everyone in this room agrees to is that we're looking for a rights-based approach to any kind of social policy. And when I say social policy, I mean education, health, water, sanitation, social protection, sort of a triad or quadrat of important public policies, and seeing these areas as areas that should be public goods that are accessible. So if one says that social policy should be rights-based, the question then is it transformative? When would it be transformative? If we look at the past 70 years of human rights legislation, if we look at 50 years of UN policies around economic and social justice and now emerging ecological justice, we see a huge disconnect between the realities and between the norms. UNRISD has defined transformation or a transformative intent as a policy that actually tries to restructure the underlying generative framework of social injustice. And that's a tall order, and we've been trying to do that ever since forever, but ever since 1948 with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So this notion of trying to really restructure. So what my paper tries to do is to see, are there handles, are there examples of transformative effort if we read policies as policy interventions, policy innovations with a positive twist, so to speak, the way also Valeria has been doing and the way Magdalena is doing. Do we find policies that are universalist, that are rights-based, and that have this transformative potential? I'm going to skip this and go straight into some examples from South and Southeast Asia that I think are of interest for this transformative effort, human rights-based kind of orientation. For example, in India, school meals, universal school meals, Supreme Court decision, every child in India in a public school, including also now in the madrasa schools, is meant to be provided with a warm school meal. What's transformative about that in a society that is very much riven both by class and by caste differences, the idea of all children sitting around a common table, I mean that's the image, could have an effect of bringing all children of different social situations into one situation. In India and Nepal, there's now a right to secondary education, which is meant to be universally provided by the government. In the area of policies addressing employment, the very famous employment scheme in India, many critiques, but the main driving idea is that there's a guarantee to have employment for a certain number of days, which are meant to be sufficient to cover a family's basic income. Transformative, if that idea of the guarantee which can be claimed and which can be claimed from the government, and if it's not provided, you're meant to receive a social assistance transfer, is meant to be changing how a citizen perceives their right to not be unemployed, to not be totally in poverty. There's also a gender component in it because of the idea that women should be primarily the people employed, which again has two sides to it. If we're looking at social protection in particular, a focus of this session, there's interesting examples of income poverty related social transfers, social pensions for the older generation. Myanmar just introduced a social pension. Nepal has had a social pension since 1995, as has had India, meaning that as a citizen of a country, you actually have a right in very old age to be covered by at least minimum income. Age-related social protection, child benefits. Many countries have a rights-based approach to the child benefit in the categorical sense of saying the excluded, the discriminated, historically discriminated groups by caste, by gender, girl children and children from the disadvantaged castes are given social transfers to initiate, to incentivize their going to school. The Bangladesh example is very, very famous for the education sector, which this girl child targeted education grant now reaching, having achieved that more girls are attending, out of a cohort, more girls than boys are attending school. And they now actually have to extend it to boy children because they are now the disadvantaged group, as it were. And very important specific standalone, or not standalone, but explicit strategies or interventions around social inclusion with these different grants in South Asia and Southeast Asia that address the caste and the gender and the tribal and the faith-based discrimination. All of these can be criticized. We just heard in the Pakistan example, which I like to quote as a positive example of gender-based affirmative action with a universalist vision, because it's women who receive the social assistance grant. But as we've just heard from Magdalena, there's an entry level of having to pay $2 to get the registration card that you require as the woman heading the household, or the senior woman in the household rather, to actually access this Pakistan, this Benazir income support grant, is again, a difficulty. But at the same time, there is this notion of there's the government. It's no longer faith-based, as in the zakat system in Pakistan. It's now a government-based, publicly funded, tax-funded scheme that is directed to the women in the household. So transformative potential, transformative effort, universalist ideas, which I think are extremely important if we're looking at, breaking the cycles of inequality. Where did all these movements or these interventions come from? I think in every single case, if we went through the details, and we've published a book that sort of tries to document the different efforts in South Asia, and there's new work emerging on Myanmar and Thailand. Where did these interventions come from? They didn't drop from the sky. They were obviously the outcome of serious contention. In some of the countries, there was actually civil war, such as in Nepal, which then led the post-crisis government, the post-conflict government, to say we need a whole package of social policies to heal the wounds and to do nation building and to actually have social inclusion and address poverty. In India, the employment scheme and the different other social pension and other schemes, insurance around health as well, were driven by contestation, starting, for instance, by the Sewa women's movement, who was claiming rights for women in the informal economy, and this sort of spilled over into political contestation, into demonstrations, into marches, and then finally was adopted. Similarly, in Myanmar, we have 60 years of civil strife and new measures, for instance, to allow trade unions, which to me is a part of a social policy arrangement, is something, again, that was fought over very hard. So they're politically driven either by changes in government or by major events. Something that really strikes me from this particular conference is that almost every presentation that I heard was at some point in the presentation referring either to the crisis, the enormous economic and financial crisis of 2008, 2009, or to some other major event that made people wake up. The climate change was not referred to so much, but I think that's an undercurrent. And now sort of this changing political environment. So there's an awareness that you need a crisis. Unfortunately, one needs a crisis to get something that goes in the direction of transformative change. Having said that, in these countries that this paper looks at in South and Southeast Asia, we're now experiencing the backlash. The same as we know from the northern countries. We're having the exact same process in most of the so-called the global South, and so all of these countries now see a backlash either in the form of budget cuts, which is the case in India, in the form of the government. I forgot to mention the Thailand Universal Health Coverage Scheme, which I think also has transformative potential because it covers all citizens of Thailand, but also migrants who are resident in the country. So it's a very positive view on universality. In Thailand, the government is now saying we can't afford, or we don't need, or there's design problems. Let's discontinue the universal health coverage. In Nepal, it's a bit more of a mixed bag. In Myanmar, it's a bit more of a mixed bag because probably in Myanmar and in Nepal, where society remains very riven, social policy is maybe, one could say, not really transformative, but is being instrumentalized for social cohesion in two countries where there's a lot of social tension. So the conclusion is that this rights-based approach, this looking at transformative effort and potential, is always acquired or achieved by contestation, but they're very vulnerable. It's not, as we experience in our own countries, something that's been acquired that we think is now a right, that's understood, that's universal, it's fixed, it's there. It can easily be undermined and it can easily be swept away, much more easily than I think many of us sort of optimists were thinking until recently, that anything can be dismantled. So my case here is to say that we need to look at social policy in this political sense, what is achieved and how is it achieved, and remember that we now, or realize that we're now in a situation where we probably have to fight back and to defend the accomplishments that have been achieved over the past decades, and of course make them much deeper, because the transformation that we want, this massive restructuring that would be needed for social justice and ecological justice and gender justice will not come easily and is being contested from many sides at this point. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for this opportunity to thank, of course, the ILO, but also the UN Research Institute and Social Development for this invitation and for the organization of this important panel. As was mentioned, I want to talk about how we can bring this human rights-based approach to the inclusion of persons with disabilities and social policies, and in a specific when we talk about social protection. As a special rapporteur on the rights of persons with disabilities, this has been an issue of key relevance for my mandate, for my work. So I produced already 2 reports. Christina mentioned one on disability inclusive social protection, but also I produced recently another one on, actually 3 now that I'm thinking about, one on inclusive social policies and one on support services for persons with disabilities that relates to the presentation that was just made on the policies of care. But so everything seems from a human rights-based approach, because for persons with disabilities, although we cannot say that we have not been considered as objects of social policy, we've never been considered as subjects of social policy. And that is changing, and I have to say it's rapidly changing, but still we have a lot of challenges. the change started about, I would say, 10, 11 years ago with the adoption of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. That change, and we always talk about the paradigm shift in which persons with disabilities are no longer conceived as, and I'm going to start with the time because I'm going to forget, are no longer conceived as subjects, as objects of care or receivers of care, but actually as subjects, active subjects that benefit from these social policies and from social protection. And this is very important. This is a dramatic change, because for long, and this is interesting, I discussed that a lot with Christina when I was drafting my report on social protection. Persons with disabilities and the community of persons with disabilities had a kind of allergic reaction when they talked about social protection. Because we didn't want more social protection, because social protection meant exclusion, segregation, marginalization, meant dependency. So everything was designed in a way that persons with disabilities will be institutionalized by social protection systems, that will be segregated, so special schools, special services, and not active members of the community. Or social protection schemes were not designed to promote the active participation of persons with disabilities. And that I want to discuss a little bit with you. We have now a lot of opportunities, not only with the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, but also, and this has been mentioned, with the Sustainable Development Goals. But of course, with the Sustainable Development Goals, and I'm going to look to Magdalena now, because I know that there is a lot of criticism, and I think it's valid criticism about the limitations that the SDGs have when it comes to embracing a human rights-based approach, right? It is true that it's a development tool, although I never like to make that distinction, but by doing that, the SDGs lacked a strong human rights-based approach. Having said that, for persons with disabilities, the SDGs have become a fundamental advocacy tool. For the first time, persons with disabilities achieved 7 concrete references on the development agenda, and the SDGs we were totally absent. And having those references in the Sustainable Development Goals, it's making a lot of changes when it comes to, of course, the development indicators, discussion on data collection and data disaggregation, but also, and hopefully, although this is another challenge that we have been discussing, on resource mobilization, right? I mean, that new resources are needed and should be committed by the international community to be able to advance in the implementation of all these new commitments. Of course, our main goal from the disability community is to make sure that whatever happens in the implementation of the SDGs, and with this motto that is fantastic for us, the leaving no one behind, is actually done based on a human rights-based approach. And I want to discuss a little bit how does it look like for persons with disabilities, perhaps. One of the first questions, and perhaps it's redundant, but why is that we need to talk about disability inclusive development, disability inclusive social policies, or disability inclusive social protection, to be more specific? And then we always said, of course, and I don't need to insist with you on the importance of social policy and social protection, but of course, discussing disability inclusion is a matter of social justice. It is a fact that in all around the world, persons with disabilities are being left behind and that are disproportionately affected by poverty and inequality. So we need to somehow respond and pay that debt that we have with persons with disabilities. Persons with disabilities also incur in a range of extra cost in our daily activities, and that is almost never recognized, that we have higher costs to perform the same activities that the rest of the community or people in the community or the other members of the community. Also, persons with disabilities face higher rates of higher stigma, discrimination, exclusion. Working age adults are out of the labor market more frequently and at a higher rates than persons without disabilities, and the salaries of persons with disabilities are also lower worldwide. And I'm going to start talking about worldwide because it's also interesting for me that for long we accepted this discourse that persons with disabilities disabilities were overrepresented in the Global South, and the poverty rates of persons with disabilities in the Global South were higher, but indeed evidence shows that it works the same for persons with disabilities living in the developed world. So persons with disabilities in rich countries are also facing these challenges of lower salary rates, higher poverty rates, etc. And of course, due to discrimination and stigma, we don't have access to the same opportunities we face. And I'm glad that the broad definition of accessibility that Magdalena presented included aspects of disability. We face a lot of barriers to access and enjoy the regular services that are designed without taking into consideration persons with disabilities. It is also, and for pragmatical reasons, I always use this. I think it's important to also give them the economic causes and economic arguments for it. It's inclusion of persons with disabilities is also a matter of sustainable growth. So we're talking about, and there is an important research piece of the ILO saying that the exclusion of persons with disabilities from labor market can range or represent about 3 to 7% of the GDP of a country. So countries are losing money because of the lack of inclusion and the lack of participation of persons with disabilities. And I think this is important. I just want to check, we have 15 minutes or 10 minutes? Okay.
You have another phone.
Okay, I will try to make sure that.
You don't need to use it all.
Yeah, I know, but that's why I need to check. So how do we then, of course now we are, and the big question now after the adoption of the convention and that we have also the sustainable development goals making references to persons with disabilities is, okay, but how? How do we advance in this design of policies and social protection that is inclusive of persons with disabilities? What is the type of support that will be required by the stakeholders at national level to advance in these efforts? What types of technical assistance should be given to the national implementation efforts? Of course, I don't have answers to all these questions, but I'm trying to, at least in my reports, to present policymakers with some of the lines and guidance to find those solutions. And so I invite you to, of course, it's always difficult to read reports of special rapporteurs, but it might be interesting to look at some of them because I don't have the time now to go into the detail. But however, I want to share with you some of my reflections on how we can advance towards this disability inclusive design of policies and implementation of policies, whether it's the SDGs or any other social policy, or policies that are designed to implement the SDGs based on a human rights-based approach, right? I mean, we really need, and this is crucial because the alternative is very damaging for persons with disabilities. We are not going to achieve full participation and inclusion unless we do consider that. So the first consideration, and of course it's a very logical consideration, is that any policy should be CRPD compliant, so compliant with the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and we need to make sure that those instruments are reinforced. Second element is within consultation and participation of persons with disabilities, and this is a core change. Before, persons with disabilities were always represented by groups of professionals, doctors, etc. Now, a core issue is to make sure that persons with disabilities engage directly in the processes of decision making. Accessibility was mentioned, but I think that for us it has a very important piece. It's infrastructure, access to infrastructure, transportation, communication and information, technologies, everything that can help persons with disabilities to participate and to enjoy this. The other important issue is the support services. Support services, and with that, although I agree with a lot of what was presented when discussed under the economy of care, we don't like the language very much, and we're challenging the languages because we think that instead of care receivers, we want to be we want to have or be beneficiaries of support. We want to think about how you design support services to promote the participation and inclusion of persons with disabilities. And those support services, of course, will benefit, as was mentioned, also the situation of women that are overrepresented as caregivers or carers of persons with disabilities. But for us, it's important, and social protection can play a fundamental role in providing and planning for support services for persons with disabilities, although I don't have time to invest in that, but support services meaning personal assistance, meaning even technology or other kind of supports for mobility, communication, and independent living. And then I want enter into law, but the non-discrimination principle through all the social policy design, and I think that Magdalena explained that in extent, so I don't have to explain why social protection is important for persons with disabilities or for anyone, but how do we build those social protection systems? And I also will try to be very brief. We do need to revise the legal and institutional frameworks that are currently in place for persons, for the social protection systems as a whole, right? From the legal frameworks where we have to be careful about avoiding any kind of discrimination, but also to make sure that indeed persons with disabilities are included and considered in those institutional and legal frameworks. Also, we need to think about the system design, because there is a lot of discussions about how we make sure that both contributory and non-contributory schemes are protecting the rights of persons with disabilities, are considering the rights of persons with disabilities. How do we make sure that persons with disabilities that might not be participating in the contributory schemes due to the lack of participation in the labor force or due to the lack of participation in the labor force mainly, are protected by non-contributory schemes of the same quality that might also support their needs. So we have to think about that. We also need to think about how to have mainstream services or inclusion of persons with disabilities in the mainstream services and benefits, but we might also need to have specific streams of benefits of programs for persons with disabilities. But we need to have a balance, because otherwise we will have problems with the exclusion of persons with disabilities. I need to finish. I want to say that the benefit package should also be taking into account what are the specific needs of persons with disabilities, the costs that we have, because otherwise the benefit package is not going to be relevant for persons with disabilities. We encounter many times that you have a benefit that is not relevant for persons with disabilities. And another important issue is that there's two final thoughts. I didn't have the time to go to the resource mobilization issue, but I mentioned the dangers or the problems that we're facing with the need to distinguish between the disability-related extra cost and how this cost should be always covered and considered, and how do we need to separate that from income security benefits, because sometimes income security benefits are linked to, for instance, the right to have health coverage or the right to have specific benefits to covered for the extra cost of disability. We need to disentangle that, because if we don't, sometimes when persons with disabilities try to find a job and get a job, they lose the income security, and at the same time they lose the other package, and that puts persons with disabilities in a very precarious condition. And the other issue that I believe is very important to consider is that we have to make sure that no matter what, social protection systems will never endanger the enjoyment of rights of persons with disabilities. And we still see that, for instance, conditions to receive benefits or to receive support are linked to the need of give up of a right. So you receive this, but you have to show that you are under guardianship. So you have to resign to your legal capacity to be able to receive a certain benefit. And that cannot happen anymore. And this is something that is still prevalent. We need to discuss further about how realistic it is, what does it mean in terms of resources, what is the role of the states and the international cooperation systems in resource mobilization, but I will leave it there because my time is up. So thank you very much.
First of all, I think this was an excellent set of papers, and they all have forcefully demonstrated the benefits of applying a human rights-based approach to social protection, not only for building universal and inclusive social protection systems which are protective, but also systems that are actually empowering. And I think the last presentation was very clear on what would that entail. It's also very important to mention, again, what Magdalena said, that a human rights-based approach to social protection is grounded in obligations enshrined in international human rights conventions and standards, and that all signatory states have the obligation actually to ensure that these rights are realized and respected in the policy processes, policy design and implementation, and also in the monitoring of these policies. So in a nutshell, I would say, as my general comment, a human rights-based approach to social protection improves social policies, and by extension, hopefully, social outcomes. And it also fosters political participation and good governance. It will therefore help countries to achieve the SDGs and to foster transformative change. And now I very briefly have a very short comment and one question each for the different presentations. So Magdalena's paper on using key human rights principles for ensuring inclusion in social assistance programs is a clear example how the human rights-based approach can help to improve policies and implementation processes in a very concrete way. And I think the paper has really excellent checklists that can be used by policymakers in order, to make sure that the policies, recognize and implement human rights in these different, in the four areas she had outlined. It identifies obstacles to access programs for different groups and suggests measures actually to promote their inclusion, which would make policies more universal and more effective. The focus on social assistance, I think, is also very timely because many countries have expanded non-contributory programs in a context where the contribution-financed social insurance has stagnated. What I found particularly interesting is that the human rights-based approach requires governments to enter into dialogue with communities and to spend actually time and resources to learn about their needs and to tailor programs accordingly. So there is this combination of a universal right, but also the attention to the special circumstances. My question to Magdalena is of how successful the SDGs have been in integrating the human rights-based approach to social protection in the agenda and also in its implementation. The paper by Valeria Esquivel is very rich in showing how the human rights-based approach to social protection is conducive to an inclusive policy process, as it invites broad participation and allows for an active role of social movements, such as women's movements. And this leads to improvements and better institutionalization of rights of all actors involved. So in this case, not only persons with care needs, but also the caregivers, both paid and unpaid. The paper also identifies key ingredients for successful reform of care policies: the gender perspective, the acknowledgement and the attention to the human rights-based approach at regional and national levels, but also the new idea of establishing a coordinated care system beyond sectoral approaches, and the political will to expand fiscal space, which was especially important in Uruguay. So given these quite stringent conditions, for successful cases, my question is about the replication of these models and the potential the care approach has in other contexts in other countries. Gabriele's paper on social policy in South and Southeast Asia describes the social turn in Thailand, India, Nepal, and Myanmar, which has raised global attention because the approach differs strongly from the classical European welfare state model. And given the particular characteristics of labor markets and society in these countries, it was strongly grounded in rights, and it focused both on poverty reduction and social inclusion. And I think this combination is very interesting, and the way the policies, were designed to achieve these goals. So the paper also shows how important the political drivers were, in particular electoral politics, but also pressure from civil society, but also the difficulty in maintaining the acquired rights, or to claim that these rights become substantive rights through quality services and reliable transfer. My question is whether there are signs of resistance against the attempts of some governments to roll back on these social entitlements, and if these groups or actors actually make use of legal instruments, and how the international community could also support the transformative change process that has started a couple of years ago and is now under threat. And finally, the paper by Catalina gives us an excellent account of the importance of social protection policies for disabled persons and describes the various obstacles and structural barriers they face in accessing these services and programs. The paper provides guidelines on how to mainstream provisions for disabled persons in all social protection policies based on a rights-based approach in order to guarantee equal access, but also the special provisions required to participate fully in society and also in the labor market. UNRISD has analyzed innovative policy approaches to foster transformative change in its most recent flagship report. And I was wondering whether you could tell us a little bit more, Catalina, about interesting examples of actually kind of real-world disability-inclusive social protection programs, especially from the Global South, and maybe what has driven, some of the successful cases. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Katja, for your really stimulating and thought-provoking comments. And given that we're a bit short in time, I would suggest that we collect a couple of more questions, and then we do one round of replies and responses then at the end. So, Catalina, would you like to start the response?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the mention of the event with the unions. I was briefly in the opening of that event, and I think also it was a very successful event. With regards to, I would like to mention 3 things that I believe are important. Of course, there are successful cases, and we're seeing more. For instance, in Zambia, there is new cash transfer, a social cash transfer that is paying special attention to persons with severe disabilities, and this is welcome. I see that in low and middle income countries, we see more engagement and willingness to engage in these discussions and developing the schemes of personal assistance, of to provision of assistive devices, wheelchairs, in a way that is not as in the charity approach. But we are also, and I forgot to mention that we're also facing very challenging moments with all the austerity measures. And persons with disabilities and most of the developed world are being the ones that are more affected by these austerity measures. And I think that this is important to highlight how the impact is going and how we are still in a transition in the low and income and the low and middle income countries, and then seeing a backlash in the developed world, which is also a reason of concern. Then there is another issue with regards to for instance, in the case of Zambia and the good effort that they're doing, that we're finding a bottleneck when it comes to the human rights-based approach with the way in which the disability assessment and the disability determination for targeting process is being made. And I cannot expand on that, but that is an issue that requires further research, further development, because there is still no way in which this is being done in a very human rights-based approach, and it is the filter through which persons with disabilities are benefiting or not, and basically is done through a very medical approach, which is not conducive to a human rights-based approach. And finally, the question on how the beneficiaries are considered themselves as right holders. That is a big transformation, I think. And the CRPD, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, introduces the notion of social protection and support as a right. And I think that is changing the way in which persons with disabilities are advocating for their right to social protection. But still, I think it's a very initial work, and it's a transition. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much, Catalina. And Gabriele, if you want to comment, please.
Thank you. I'll start with Alexandra's question, whether rights holders are becoming more aware of their rights. And just one example, in Nepal, where there's child benefits in very remote areas, and the women, usually the women who come and claim the benefit, have to really walk for a day, etc. And there's very interesting, actually, film, video clips and so forth done by UNICEF, where the women say the benefit is very little money, but it's much too low and it has to be revised and reformed. But it gives them the sense that the government sees them. and that government is aware that they exist, and that is changing something both in their personal identity as, you know, a citizen of Nepal, as it were, but also as they're in their position in the household, because they are bringing back a little bit of cash in households that are very cash-strapped. So I think there are signs that there's a changing awareness of what one's rights are. On Katya's question, signs of resistance. First of all, I think we all know that the political space is shrinking in all of these countries, with civil society being disfunded, not receiving funding anymore, or actually being forbidden. So it's much more difficult than it was even 5-6 years ago to claim rights and to do contestation. And that applies across the board to all the countries that I've been looking at. But at the same time, I think as a countercurrent, we do have two countercurrents. One is sort of Magdalena's area of the international soft law, all the covenants and conventions that have their periodic review processes, and I think they are extremely important as one way of reclaiming, of defending and reclaiming by saying in the periodic review of the Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, or on the CEDAW and the CRC, etc., and many of those reports do point out to the importance of the social protection and social policy measures. And the other process, maybe this sounds a bit UN-ish, but I do have a certain degree of trust or expectation on the 2030 agenda of the United Nations, because at the indicator level, there's interesting discussions going on which indicators need to be created. The third tier, those of you who are in that process, the third tier of indicators that haven't been registered so far, and the disaggregation debates, disaggregating not just by sex, but also by various other forms of social exclusion. And I think as that process moves forward, combined with the fact that the negotiations of that 2030 agenda had a very strong component, notably of the women's rights movement, of the women's major group, who are internationally networked, and I see some friends from Rica in the audience who are internationally networked, and I think that sort of pressure these are pressure points, I think someone was saying, that can be used even in countries where the actual political space is shrinking, but governments also don't want to be shamed too much. So I think there is some space, and I hope I'm not too optimistic.
Great, thank you very much, Gabriele, and I'll turn over to Valeria.
Thank you. Both questions were more or less the same. So, and every time, being a Latin American myself, every time I'm proposing one of the good examples from my region, it's always the accusation is, okay, that is particular, the particularism of Latin America. And other times I remember there was the particularism of Cuba, and so, so Latin America and all the rest are different. I think that was not my message. My message was that these ingredients and identifying this fertile soil can lead to or could help in other cases to progress with the care agenda. And in fact I have two answers to that. First, we along with Andrea Kaufman and as a background report for UNRISD, we prepared for the Ever Foundation a piece that can be downloaded and perhaps is there as well, which is called Innovations in Care, New Concepts, New Actors and New Policies. What we did was digging into the 18+20 reports. So those are gender reports, in order to see whether care was mentioned at the national level and at the regional level. And the takes are very different. Asian countries, if it is mentioned, it's all about women's labor force participation in a very liberal way of framing. So there are competing framings out there. It's not that they are not mentioned, sometimes they are not even mentioned, but there are competing framings out there. So our take is, and at the end of all these reviews, to me, what stands out is that care is a political issue. And by political, it's not only about the electoral platform. But political is, it is part of what women's movements and other social movements are able to articulate. And to that, the SDG is a hook, it's a way, it's an entry point. And it's an entry point in social policy, in social protection. So we have to be able to help to articulate that, or to listen to how it is articulated. Also, I should say that Target 5.4 speaks about infrastructure, basic infrastructure as conducive to care. So this also, when colleagues and friends from Africa, they said this is the priority. So and there are very many reasons why care services are not the priority. Some of them is we don't entrust our children to the state. So I think so again, I wouldn't like to fall into this particularism and understand different contexts, and we really did an effort to overview these care policies across the global south. But at the same time, what to me stands out as common is the political issue. And if I may, I would like to make a comment to Catalina on this care as contested concept, because it is contested. And for good reasons. The very same way we found in early education teachers who are professional, they don't want to be seen as carers in terms of care being diminishing or what comes with the women's DNA as opposed to a professional, the result of professional training. But I think what the Uruguayan case teaches is that this concept, even if contested, even if bringing in sometimes agendas that were intention, was gave enough common ground to progress together. And that, I think, so if any time down the line we find any other concept that is as fruitful as this, to bring together progressive forces, we might go for that other concept. But in this case, and again, the Uruguayan example stands out. This is, I think, the interesting political take around the care concept, and I wanted to flag that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Valeria. I think there could be a long discussion on that point only, but I think we have to wrap up soon. So I'll give the last word to Magdalena.
Thank you. The issue of national resources. I think this is a very important issue. Traditionally, the human rights movement has been very skeptic and reluctant to address issues of resource mobilization. What is very stupid, because how you're going to realize rights without having the money to do that. However, increasingly, this has been changing. And I think that this has been crystallized by the crisis in 2007, 2008, which made evident that you cannot keep on asking states to realize rights if you do not address issues of resource mobilization and only address issues of resource distribution. And it has changed. So now it is clear that when we are talking, and there's been important step taken by human rights monitoring bodies that are saying if you want to realize rights to states, you have to battle illicit financial flows, you have to take progressive taxation measures. There's been a lot of discussion about tax and gender and taxing multinational corporations. Now we have this consolidated approach. Much more needs to be done. Still, it's not done in a very systemic way. And this allowed me to open up also a criticism in the way we all work. The human rights movement has been dominated by lawyers, as myself, and that is very problematic. And some other movements have been dominated by economists. My point is we cannot keep on working on silos. We have to have a multidisciplinary approach. I hope that those that the IMF and the World Bank, I wish they will have a more social justice and rights-based approach and that put people more at the center. But I also hope that the human rights movement consolidate this trend to look at issues of resource mobilization as critical for the future. If we want to keep being relevant, the human rights movement has to do more with resource mobilization, and other movements and this own house has to be more concerned about rights. Rights, not only those labor standard rights, but more generally issues of rights, because the human rights discourse is a powerful discourse. It has so much behind, and it brings over a set of normative obligations that can help and can mobilize people. I mean, they're a set of universally agreed values. So thank you for that. Then on the issue of social protection and being considered charity, I agree with Gabriele. I do believe that it has also changed quite significantly. That in the beginning and in some programs, people, when you ask them, and I have been lucky enough to interview a lot of sort of recipients of social assistance in many countries, increasingly it's not God that it's not the state. They're increasingly seeing it as a right. But this is absolutely linked to the way in which the program is designed. So if the program is institutionalized and there are the mechanisms, of course people are going to feel more inclined to have a right. If it's under the First Lady office and it's a cash transfer program that tomorrow can disappear, people are not stupid. They know that it's better to keep quiet. But increasingly, because in my view of this rights-based approach that bring institutional mechanisms, that it's incorporated in decrees, in regulations, in laws, in the constitution. Brazil, good example, but now I should take it out with the new government. But in a way, it has been, but also with the grievance mechanism. I mean, programs have been increasingly designed good grievance mechanism. So when people are empowered to submit a grievance about their social assistance program, it is because they see it as a right. Because of course you're not going to complain against something that it might be taken away. So that is a good signal. And we have seen how increasingly the design of, in particular, cash transfer programs, but also public work programs are incorporating grievance mechanism, and that is a good signal. And transparency. But of course, there's much more that needs to be done to ensure that people are going to claim not only the $12 if, but they're going to claim for a comprehensive set of provisions that is not only the cash transfer that they might have or the public work program that they might have, but they're going to start claiming that that is done in respect of all their dignity, and that there is public services, and that there is treated well. But again, and this is also, it was also mentioned by Gabriele, that also requires to expand the democratic space. If we keep on, if the states keep on shrinking the democratic space, there is not going to be effective poverty reduction mechanism, because people are not going to be able, and they're going to be scared to complain. So everything is so interlinked that we have to start working from a more multidisciplinary approach. We have to start working all the tools at our disposal, and we need to engage in a conversation that is much broader to our siloed professional views. Thank you.
Yeah. So thank you very much to all the speakers for this really, really interesting and stimulating discussion. I wish we should have 3 days for that. But until the next occasion, we'll try to organize something. I would just, I think your point really about breaking up the silos and really kind of getting more concrete. I think that strikes again back to the platform and to the important role that this platform can play. And I would really like to invite everyone not just to look at the platform and to use the resources which are there, but also think about ways of how to improve it. And I mean, we very much welcome your contributions to that and to your ideas how that can be improved in the future. And I would also like to invite you. There's some publications there on the table if you want to take up some when you get up. So thank you very much. Thank you for your patience also, for kind of postponing your lunch break. And so thank you very much, and I hope to see you next time.